kind of, oh, I must have talked to Julie for years about all this because, it's all in her book. So I feel a familiarity that I haven't earned. So forgive me if I treat you too
No, it's
casually
fine. And
like
I
that.
feel that too, actually, which is why it's so nice to finally actually really meet you.
Yeah, well, here we are. I'm in
I also
Massachusetts.
have all your books, by the way.
Yeah, well, I know you do because you've got reference to stuff I've written
Mhm.
in your book, Building God's Kingdom, and we're going to go there. But where are you sitting as we speak? Where are you?
I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. I teach
Okay.
at the University of North Florida.
Yeah, that'll all say in the introduction. And I am north of Boston, and
Did you
I
say
live in
north of Austin
Jacksonville,
or Boston?
Boston, Massachusetts.
Ah, lovely. I'm from Maine.
Well, there you are. Where you're halfway home when you're sitting here with me. Where were you from in Maine?
I'm from Bath.
Okay. Hey, I
Yeah.
like that. I
I
know
still
Maine
spend a
pretty
lot of
well.
time there, like a
Yeah.
couple of months every summer.
Well, one of these times when you're driving from Boston Airport up 95 to wherever you go, give me a call and come by for some coffee.
That would be lovely. Yeah,
Oh,
I take a very slow route because I have a camper
oh
and
well, hey,
I stay in my camper at a friend's house when I get up there. So I just kind of meander and take my
there you
time.
are.
That would be nice.
Okay, so let's get all official here and let me
Okay.
introduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and this is a podcast and a YouTube live event and a Facebook event, and then it goes where podcasts go. And today I'm talking with someone I already feel I know pretty well because A, I've read her book, and B, there's a lot in her book about my family because she writes about something that our family had something to do with. So my guest is Julie Ingersoll, and she is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. And she's also the author of a book called Building God's Kingdom Inside the World of Christian Reconstruction. Now, before I go any further, I just have to say, for years, having left the evangelical movement and the far right, which then morphed into the new Republican Party that got Donald Trump elected, stormed the Capitol, and so forth. This is crazy history that's become totally unhinged. I was one of the few people that I know in writing and in public speaking about Reconstructionism and the theonomous movement and Rushdoony and what my father's role was that. So when I read your book, Building God's Kingdom, from then on, when people ask me about this, I say, well, someone has written a definitive book on the subject,
Very
and her
kind.
name is Julie Ingersoll. And if you're interested in this, you should buy her book. So I just wanted you to know that.
Thank you very much. I hope folks will forgive my constant grinning because I feel this isn't a happy topic and smiling about it seems odd, except that I feel the same way about our paths having crossed in so many different ways. And it
Yeah.
is so nice to actually finally have a conversation one-on-one with you and get to meet you. It's really
Well,
nice.
I feel the
So,
same. I pulled the Kindle edition up of your book again this morning just to see if I was remembering everything correctly. And it's so funny because when you put Schaeffer into the search, you come up with my dad and you come up with him a lot. And then you come up with you talking about my book, Crazy for God. And then there's
mhm.
footnotes. So it's like, Julie and I are already very much on the same path here. So we'll share some things with people. One of the areas I want to talk about that's made a huge impact that came out of the Reconstructionist movement is the whole homeschooling movement. And you go there again in a way that no one else has done in real depth. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you, for people listening to this and watching us, um, to define what the Reconstructionist movement is, one, and two, if you can remember this, to then talk about its updated impact in the present. And one name jumps out to me, which is Mike Johnson, who's now Speaker of the House.
Mhm.
And I'll only set you up by saying this, and that is back in the day in the 70s and 80s, when my father and I were very influential in this movement, we were still outsiders and we were agitators. So we got our meetings with the president. My dad stayed in the Ford White House. He would always be talking about these issues, bringing America back to God in a kind of a Reconstructionist way. The big difference between now and then, 50 years later, is that these people are not only insiders now, they are the Republican Party. And a guy like Mike Johnson is as much of a Reconstructionist Rushdoony follower as anybody you quote in your book. And so I'm 71 years old, and in my lifetime, what was a kind of an agitative movement on the outside of mainstream American politics is now running one of the political parties
And the House of Representatives.
and the House of Representatives and put Trump in the presidency. So that's all I would say. But would you take us back and explain Reconstructionism, the history of it, the impact of it, and then just remind me a little later to talk about how it's influenced the homeschool movement, kind of generally.
Okay. Although I think that that's actually you've pinpointed the most important core of the whole argument of my book, which is that Rushdoony wasn't the only one to come up with these ideas. And of course, your father was a more well-known contributor of many of these ideas. But what Rushdoony did that other people didn't do, first of all, I think in order to understand the religious right, it isn't a matter of making a claim that one person is the person. It's
Sure.
actually a zillion threads. And anybody who's writing about this and pulling out a thread is kind of contributing to the understanding of the whole.
Yeah.
So in writing about Rushdoony, I make no claims that somehow he is more important than other people or that other people aren't part of the picture.
Yeah.
I'm just pulling out that thread. And I think that what Rushdoony did that other people didn't do is he took the ideas and he instantiated them in institutions, particularly schools, and built an effort to undermine public education. So when we get to that, I think that's actually the most important point.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, so Christian Reconstructionism is a movement that started, Rushdoony started writing in about the 1960s, and it kind of built in numbers and influenced up through the 80s. Rushdoony argues that we should order civil society according to biblical law, in keeping with commitments from the Reformation, the notion of the unity of Scripture. He takes the Bible to be authoritative from Genesis to Revelation, a continuing revelation, not the New Testament replacing the Old in the way that a lot of Christians do. And he has a framework that he draws from the Reformation called sphere sovereignty, in which he articulates biblical mandates for every possible issue that you could imagine. And my work is about explaining that large worldview, what the world might look like if we ordered it according to biblical law, the way that Rushdoony wished that we might, and to look at the structure and institutions by which that idea became really this hugely important idea in the Republican Party. And that's the short version, and we can unpack that for as much time as you'd like.
Yeah, one thing I would just throw out is that I think a lot of people that I've talked to in the past and who have interviewed me unintentionally give away the fact that they have no idea about two things. One, just how radical Rushdoony and his followers were in terms of the American mainstream. It went far past simply wanting to bring a little more religion into life.
Right.
I knew Rushdoony, and I spent 3 days with him once at his Chalcedon Foundation. And what was amazing to me, even back then, was the fact that he was talking about how the Constitution of the United States, in a way, was the enemy of biblical law. He wanted to go back to something much more of a theocracy. People don't get that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's division in the Reconstructionist movement and in the kind of broader umbrella of places where Reconstructionism has found a place over whether this is whether America's a Christian nation, whether it has been, whether it should be, what that would look like. But I've increasingly come to see Reconstructionism and the way that people have embraced it across what is now the Republican Party, or what the Republican Party is now. I've increasingly come to see this as basically fundamentally centered on issues of authority. And that is how you get the authoritarian character of what these folks want to do. So it was indeed very radical then. I remember back in, probably 2010, I was writing for Religion Dispatches a lot. And I remember writing that I was troubled that a lot of people who did, very few people knew about Reconstructionism anyway, but the people who did would often start by saying R.J. Rushdoony, who advocated the stoning of homosexuals, and like that's all they got. And it was obviously that's a horrible idea, and that's very radical. but it seemed to me that they missed the really important, more mundane things that Reconstructionism advocated. And at the
Mm,
time, I argued, we aren't going to start stoning homosexuals. So let's stop talking about that and start talking about the effort to dismantle public education, which is what we are doing. Now they've largely, in some places, they are in power in shaping public education
mm,
toward this goal of dismantlement. And now LGBTQ people are tremendously under threat. So obviously my initial assessment that their more radical ideas weren't likely to come to pass, and we should talk about the less radical things that were really threats,
mhm.
was both right and wrong at the same time. Because I think they were radical. I think now they are increasingly conservative. The things that they support and the arguments that they make are increasingly mainstream conservative Republican.
Yeah.
Still awful, but not out of the realm of what would seem like reality, the way that they were, say, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, you write in your book, let's see, I forget where it is, maybe page 98 or so. Christian Reconstructionists have been foundational to the homeschool movement and seek to expand their influence by using homeschooling to, quote, reconstruct society,
Mhm.
according to the model put forth by Rushdoony. Christian homeschoolers have built a network of organizations providing resources, conventions, targeted travel opportunities, museums, Film Institute in San Antonio in see Chapter 7, and colleges, especially for homeschooled students, such as Patrick Henry in Purcellville, Virginia, etc. So you go into some detail of showing how this has expanded. I think, again, people underestimate something, and that is this is not parents dissatisfied with public schools who are trying to educate their children better. These are people who have, in a way, accepted the idea that the secular American state, the separation of church and state, constitutionality of the rule of law, is not working in their favor. So they're stepping out of
Mhm.
the American matrix, and they are also sending young adults back into our politics who
Yeah.
are radicalized to a point that I don't think most people get. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit?
Well, again, I think that the reason that Rushdoony is important as a figure in history is because of what he did with regard to education. And it started actually earlier with Christian schools.
Mm,
And he worked in the legal system to establish the right to educate one's children without any regulation from the state. So Christian
yeah.
schools in many states have been autonomous from any kind of legal oversight for a very long time
Mm,
because of Rushdoony, and developed Christian school curriculum and the argument that it's a family responsibility to educate children and not a state responsibility. So therefore it's unbiblical for states to have public schools. All of that in the 70s and 80s, when we had the people with fighting, opposing desegregation and trying
mm,
to escape public schools that were getting desegregated. We had that blip in the rise of the Christian school movement, and that was followed by the rise of the homeschool movement, maybe starting in the early 80s.
yeah.
But the Christian homeschooling movement was actually built on the foundations laid by the Christian school movement a
Yeah.
decade earlier.
Which was
Uh,
about a white flight from
that
desegregated
it's
schools.
I got I've thought about this a lot over the years because I've very much I paid attention and learned a whole lot more
Mm,
about race and racism than I knew when I first started writing about this stuff.
yeah.
Because the Christian schools often would really pride themselves on having a couple of Black students, and
Mhm.
they would be opposed to racism and segregation, and yet it seemed quite clear that there was this connection. And I think now my view is that what happened was they didn't want to keep their white kids in schools where there were Black kids, but
Mm,
they didn't want to say that.
yeah.
And Rushdoony came along with this biblical argument as to why they should not keep their kids in public schools.
Yeah.
And they got to move and have a biblically Christian defensible kind of way of
Mhm.
justifying it without saying that it was about race, but I don't think you can separate it from race.
Well, there's another person that I've been talking to on my podcast here, is Randall Balmer, who teaches
Uh-huh. Yeah.
at Dartmouth. And of course, Randall, who's a friend of mine, has said repeatedly that very similar to what you're saying, and that is to understand the beginning of the anti-abortion movement on the Protestant side of things, you have to look at the fact that Jerry Falwell, for instance, at Liberty Baptist, was looking for a way to concentrate the mind and raise the funds and brand himself as a leader again when his segregationist policies were failing, and that some of the operatives on the side of the Roman Catholic conservative movement, a little bit outside the church, but very conservative, used that to talk to him and really presented the fact that standing against abortion could kind of fill the gap after the failure of his white kind of supremacist views of desegregation. And then, he goes off and founds a college, which again admits students of other races, but it's in opposition to what he would regard as the kind of liberal or humanistic educational system. So I think all these folks were kind of prepared a long time ago for the Trumpian fake news message that everything the quote world offers you is somehow a lie, and only I have the truth. This is something that people have heard from their mother's knee who were raised in evangelical circles. And then the homeschool movement kind of goes one step further than the Christian school movement and says, we're not even putting our kids in schools. This is a congregation of one family. The Protestant ideal of, the perfect truth in this tiny little group of people, all these splits carried out to the ultimate, where it's now just, this mom and dad raising their kids according to how they read the Bible, apart from the world, kind of a separation, but then feeding radicalized, differently educated children back into the body politic, who then go off and become the, door-to-door stormtroops, if you like, for
Well, and to echo the thing that you first said before about how people don't necessarily recognize how really radical this is. They think, oh, homeschooling, well, so what? People teach their kids at home. And for many homeschoolers, that works out well. And many homeschooling parents are super dedicated, and that's why they do it. And so it's fine. But what the Reconstructionists contributed to that was this idea that the state has no role in education. And organizations like the Homeschool Legal Defense Association have worked across the country to have homeschooling be completely deregulated in most places. At places that have any regulation at all, parents have to file an affidavit with the state or some such thing. So that's the kind of component. It's not just that they're teaching their kids at home, it's that they're teaching their kids at home and they are exempting themselves from any kind of accountability for quality education. And it becomes an attraction for abusers. Not to suggest that homeschooling parents are necessarily abusers, but if you've got a completely deregulated environment where kids are precluded from interacting with the outside world, you're going to draw people who want that for the purposes of abuse, and it's been a problem.
Yeah, and no one's going to see the bruises because they're never outside of the home.
Right.
And it's become a legal matter as well. You write in your book about the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. By the 1980s, the homeschool movement comprised mainly of conservative Christians who had removed their children from public schools to give them an education that was rooted in what they see as a biblical worldview. In 1983, attorneys Mike Ferris and Mike Smith founded the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And then you go on to talk about how this has led to one legal confrontation after another. And one of those has been about discipline. And so you have this odd situation where some of these homeschool groups also, of course, have churches, often little independent churches. And I know this sounds like I'm making it up, but in the gift shop of a number of these churches, people have seen that they are selling what they call spanking spoons, which is wooden spoons on the gift shop wall, the appropriate size with which to spank your children, because there are also a lot of these same folks very much in the line of thought that corporal punishment is biblical. And they push that. And as you say, outside of the view of the public eye or any kind of mitigating institution like a school or a school bus or anything like that, a lot of these kids have been raised in total isolation. And the potential for abuse is just huge. And so talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I think it's also important to recognize that these kids can often have a very substandard education because there's no requirement that parents meet any kind of credential. They don't have to be trained as teachers. There's no requirement at all. So when you talk to formerly homeschooled folks,
Yeah.
there's a big divergence between some of them that got a really kind of philosophically and intellectually rich education by reading primary sources and talking to intelligent parents about these things, and people who didn't have any real schooling at all, and their parents called it homeschooling. And those people often find themselves out in the world as young adults with no ability to cope, because they don't have social skills, because they haven't interacted with people who aren't just like them, and they haven't had any kind of quality education. So it also becomes a matter of the rights of those children to an education so that they can prosper as full human beings later in life.
Well, one thing you talk about too in a few pages after the part I read a moment ago is the kind of increase in this paranoid sense that they are out to get you. And
Yeah.
you have quotes from people saying there'll be a knock on the door. And it's very much, it's redolent of the same paranoid language you see in the gun lobby. You know, you're going to take my gun away from my clammy, cold, dead fingers. They're going to be a knock on the door. You know, we don't have guns for home defense. We have guns to defend ourselves against this intrusive government being run by clever liberals and conspiracies. And of course, the homeschool movement really, to my knowledge anyway, were the first people to kind of encode that into the system that, you know, it's us versus them. And them, by the way, for people listening to this, is all of you who are outside of these little tiny enclaves of people who regard everyone else as sort of a potential enemy that's going to take our kids away or our guns away. And so they then push this into the framework of a Christian rights kind of stand for religious liberty. And of course, that'll bring me to another question here. And I want to just.
But before you go, there's something I wanted to add to that, because I think you're absolutely right that homeschooling fed this now out of control fear and paranoia of the government. And one of the reasons is that this organization, the HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association, they are now largely a lobby group, but they started as something like a prepaid legal service. So the way they got people to sign up for them was to terrify them. And they wrote books and pamphlets and all this stuff about people, you know, somebody, some neighbor complains about the kid getting homeschooled, so the social services come and take away all the kids, and like they've really inflamed this, and it was in their interest to do so because that made people sign up for their service and give them money.
Sure, which of course is exactly what the NRA did with guns and the gun
That was
manufacturers.
a very good comparison.
I mean, it's exactly the same thing, and very much the same cohort of people. You know, these are the same folks.
Mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, mutually reinforcing paranoia has really become the language of not just the religious right, but now the Republican Party. So I want to switch gears here because this goes right into a very big issue that affects all of us, and that is the nice little list of Supreme Court and other federal justices that the Heritage Foundation gave to Trump via people in the evangelical movement, mostly like Franklin Graham and others who were activists in trying to get this agenda as part of the reform of the courts as they saw it. So you now have a branch of the federal court system and a majority on the Supreme Court that favor, quote unquote, religious liberty issues almost over everything else in terms of ruling in favor of just these kinds of people when it's about guns or the right to educate your child as you wish, feeding the kind of paranoid delusion on the right, but saying, well, you know, we've got these laws to protect, for instance, gay men and women, but if you don't want to serve them and it's a matter of religious liberty, okay, that's fine. Then you can break the anti-discrimination laws. And of course, this carries into all sorts of areas, women's rights, you know, everything to do with civil rights that we have been taking for granted are now religious liberty issues that, yes, this is the law, but not when someone shows up claiming their religious liberty to, say, spank their child or homeschool or discriminate against gay people or fire a lesbian professor from a quote Christian college, whatever. Make the connection a little bit, because I think Building God's Kingdom, your book, which I said at the beginning, and I want to just say again, people ask me, explain this. Here's the book that explains it. Stop asking me. Read Julie's book.
Thank you.
I'm tired of talking about this. Just read her book. And I hope all the journalists and anybody who writes on these subjects have read your book, because honestly, if they want to know what they're talking about when writing about MAGA or the rise of the religious right or the takeover of the Republican Party, I mean, your book is the homework. So please, and it's beautifully written and easy to read. So little plug there. But in any case, go there. Let's make the connection a little bit. How were the steps between this kind of paranoid fantasy about they're out to get us, our kids, our guns, our culture? How does this dovetail with this, the kind of anti-immigrant replacement ideas, but also above all, Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court and the weirdness of her Christian background? It's all one thing. And it's more and more out of control. And I know you're the person to talk about it.
Well, that's a lot.
I know it's a lot.
Start with the first part of it. It is the case that, and you'll pardon the pun, but we are in a legal system where at this point, the way the Constitution is interpreted, religious freedom trumps everything.
Yeah.
No matter what regulation there is. I'm reading a book called God and the Gavel with my Religion in America students right now. And yesterday we were discussing land use issues, right? And so if there's a zoning regulation about what can happen in a certain neighborhood, and a religious organization wants to violate that or be exempt from that, the default is for a number of reasons. Part of it is the jurisprudence at the Supreme Court, but part of it is also the inability of local governments and zoning boards to withstand massive court challenges over these things. But the default is to just give exemptions for claims of religious freedom across the board. And this is it's taken a couple of centuries for us to get to a point where the Constitution is understood that way by the courts. But it's also, we've tried to manage so legal rights are always kind of in contestation with other people's legal rights, right? So it's never the case that there's well, I suppose sometimes it is, but it's usually not the case that there's a clear-cut answer that one side is right and one side is wrong. With these kinds of cases, it's usually a balancing of conflicting values and interests. And often it's conflicting values, both of which all of us share. Like, you should have zoning rules that keep a neighborhood reliably safe and have some continuity so that people can expect when they buy a house what it's going to be like. And you should also have religious freedom. Like, we kind of all agree on those things, but there are clash points where those two kinds of values are in conflict with each other. And what we've done over the last 50 years is try to manage those conflicts by providing exemptions for religious groups. And often that's just fine. So the Seventh-day Adventist can't work on Saturday, and her boss changes her job, and so she loses her job, and she applies for unemployment benefits, and the courts end up saying, yeah, you should have accommodated her and not given her a Saturday schedule. So mostly that's worked out okay. But what we have now, thanks to the Reconstructionists and the other people who are presuppositionalist in the way that they approach this, is a significant and a powerful faction of American Christians who believe that everything is religious. So it's one thing when there's clearly things that are counting like religious, like which day your Sabbath is. Okay, fine. But if everything is religious, and we have this practice of giving exemptions to generally applicable laws for things that people say are religious, that means that some people are just exempt from all laws.
Yeah.
Because everything and when I say everything, it sounds preposterous, but for example, on the basis of this kind of arguing, David Barton fought against net neutrality laws because he said they were unbiblical. Well, how he gets to the idea that that's unbiblical, you'll just have to read the book. But it's not an out of bounds conclusion from the philosophical framework that makes up this movement. And if everything is religious, we can't any longer balance those conflicting values by giving latitude and exemption for claims for religious freedom. We can't do it anymore. if everything's going to be religious.
Well, and of course, the gay community, women, anyone that gets into the sights, the sniper scope of this movement of we got to stick it to these people next in order to triumph, suffers from these decisions. And the Supreme Court now is on the side of these, religious liberty people. Everything is religion. And it reminds me very much of what happened many, many years ago before the United States was founded, when you had in Great Britain, King James trying to get this new translation of the Bible made, and there was a contest between the Puritans and the state church, which was the beginnings of the Church of England there. They had been burning heretics and this kind of thing a little before, and James was trying to level things out and say, let's get past this. And he had been indoctrinated somewhat by the Scottish Presbyterians, and then came down to England as the new king, wanted to have a new translation of the Bible. And then as a kind of a footnote, there was a little coastal community with some very disgruntled Puritans who wanted everything their way, who took off for this weird place called America and wound up here in Massachusetts, a stone's throw from where I'm sitting. And, lo and behold, they tried to make their community very much conform to exactly what we're talking about in 2024, X hundreds of years later. And it's almost sort of a deja vu all over again situation in American history, where eventually the Puritan model lost the American people in America, who wanted a more secularized constitution influenced by the Enlightenment, however imperfectly by some slaveholders like Jefferson, but nevertheless struggling for an ideal that said, no, we're going to get past this crap that we all came out of in Europe with these wars of religion. We can't have this again here. And here we are again. So, Cotton Mather and all these Puritans who came up here to Massachusetts from the UK and from Holland and other places to get it right because everyone else had failed. They're all wrong except us. That same sort of mentality. Rushdoony, and to some extent my father, Francis Schaeffer, that the roots of their movement aren't in just American history. It goes back into Europe and the wars of religion. And we're now transposing these into American culture. And most people are too ignorant of this to understand, what happened. And in Europe, the wars that came out of these things, and then I'll stop and go back to your book, were not a war. It was a 30 years war, 100 years war. There is no peace after you have a group of people who say they speak for God and opposing the rest of the people. And Jefferson and the rest tried to get us past this. And now we are reverting because of the influence in this minority of people who are white evangelical people, who themselves probably don't even know the name of Rushdoony.
They don't.
But their leaders do, and their leaders have read Francis Schaeffer and other people, my father. General public hasn't a clue. But it's this insidious movement, and where we see the effect of it is in the places you talk about in your book, Building God's Kingdom. And that is the impact of, say, the homeschool movement, which impacts everybody because it then defunds the public school movement. And then these radicalized kids come into the general culture with half-baked educations and 100% ideological purity. And what we've got is a bunch of Bay State colonialists from 1600 showing up in jeans and T-shirts with the same theology that essentially a couple hundred years ago down the road was burning and hanging witches. And we're back. It's mind-boggling. And I'm 71. If you'd asked me when you're 30, I was 30, I would have just said, no, we're moving towards a more secular, enlightened period of history. No, we've turned the clock back. And I don't think people get how that worked out for you the first time around.
The last chapter in the book is about the implications of all of this for religious violence, because that's kind of one of the areas that I specialize in. And one of my former professors and good friend, Mark Juergensmeyer, has written a book called Terror in the Mind of God. It's in its probably 4th edition at this point. It's a really good book. And one of the really important points that he makes is he talks about the ways that religion can contribute to the elevation of violence in ways that are different from other kinds of social organizations and social movements. And one of the things he points to is what he calls cosmicization. So if there's a conflict, if you and I are neighbors and we're mad at each other because we're encroaching on each other's property, we can negotiate that. We can put up a fence and each pay half or some such thing, right?
Sure.
But once we elevate that dispute to, you're a representative of Satan on earth and you're treading on God's property, it's not amenable to negotiation and resolution in ways that aren't violent. And religion helps that process, helps along this process of cosmicization and demonization also. But I think that there's a really important component of this movement that contributes to the rise that we see in this vigilante sort of violence and this feeling of justification for at least using violent rhetoric, if not literal violence, against one's political enemies. We're no longer neighbors who disagree over policy. We're now either on God's side or Satan's side. And that's extraordinarily dangerous.
Yeah, and we're going to see more of that. And
yes, we are.
I'll just reintroduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer, and this is a live event on YouTube and other places. It will be Facebook and come out as a podcast. I'm talking with my guest today, Julie Ingersoll, who is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, and author of Building God's Kingdom Inside the World of Christian Reconstruction. And I just want to note, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts. And please pay attention to my Substack. It has to be said commentaries at frankschaeffer.substack.com. We'd like people to subscribe to that because my producer Ernie and I are getting so sick of the stupid algorithms set up on all these huge media platforms where if you talk about something and 3 key words pop out, all of a sudden you're banned just for mentioning things, and it takes you weeks to unscramble this, not talking to people, but talking to computers. Speaking of the Brave New World and Animal Farm, it isn't just the Reconstructionists, it's our big algorithmically driven insanity that we're all part of. A little aside there. But in any case, Julie's written this incredible book, Building God's Kingdom, and I just want to pitch it again and say that, usually when I'm talking to an author, wonderful authors, their subject is not my subject. In other words, they're not writing about my neighborhood. But Julie's writing about something that I actually happen to know about because I was a fly on the wall and lived a lot of the incidents that she is talking about. And Julie's totally nailed it. This is a unique book, unique in its perception and unique in its depth. And I just would encourage people, anyone in the media, anybody who reports on American anything, you really need to read the book. So please note, Building God's Kingdom is an important book. So Julie, I want to go to another question here, and that is to talk about how you see something that's become interesting to me that I've been reading about and noting, and that is a lot of people are commenting on the fact that not only do a lot of the white nationalists and evangelical and Christian nationalist people not know how influenced they are by the Reconstructionist movement, sort of as if there were left-wingers who had never heard of Marx or, like that. They've gotten so far away. But more than that now, we've got a bunch of people in the Christian nationalist movement who aren't churchgoers, call themselves evangelicals, who have adopted, if you want to put it this way, the anger and the violent rhetoric, but aren't even pretending to be religiously observant. They just simply are the nationalist part of the Christian nationalists. And it's kind of a next step, again, that I would not have foreseen. So we talk about the evangelical movement, the Christian nationalists, et cetera, and a lot of these guys, in terms of any definition of what a Christian is, whether it's church-going or prayer or religious life or reading the Bible or familiarity with the teachings of Christ, they've gone to a next step, and now it's just the politics and just the MAGA Trumpism of it. And quite a few people are noting this and taking polls and so forth and so on that I've spoken to on this podcast. And I wonder if you have any feeling about that. It's not exactly the subject of your book, but you are a wise one. Speak.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, I'm trained in religious studies, so this is something I think about a lot. And part of it, I think, is that we have an impoverished definition of what counts as religion. So it is those, we think in because we live in a world that's infused with Christianity, whether we're Christians or not, we look at the categories that might seem like Christian religion, and we extrapolate from there. But we forget that, first of all of the things that we call world religions, for all the problems with that language, the world religions aren't all like Christianity, and Christianity hasn't always been like the kind of Christianity that we have now. And there was a point at which you saw these battling definitions of Christianity come into play when Anders Breivik shot
Sure.
up that island of kids doing their kind of that summer camp for citizenship thing. Because I read his manifesto, and I wrote some about this at the time, because people were trying to say, well, he's not a Christian, and in the ways that contemporary Americans think about Christianity as a sort of pietistic, private spirituality and experiential thing, that that kind of understanding of religion is very modern and very American. But Breivik conceptualized his Christianity very much like medieval Christianity, which isn't not Christianity, right? But it's a society. People didn't convert to Christianity in the medieval era because they had some personal experience, for the most part. I mean, some people did, but mostly they did because their king did. And Christianity was Christendom. It was a societal movement. And Breivik conceptualized his version of Christianity in terms of a medieval version of what it meant to be a Christian, not in terms of a contemporary American or Western idea about what it means to be. But lots of religions aren't. Judaism doesn't fit that model of this kind of differentiated private sphere that that focuses on beliefs, right? Lots of religions don't fit that model. So it seems to me that what those folks who are identifying as evangelical but not going to church are doing is embracing a version of Christianity like Breivik's, a model of Christendom, a medieval kind of understanding of, and the medievalists are just going to have at it with me because that isn't my area. But I think it's a kind of Christianity. It's just not the kind of Christianity that we are mostly accustomed to.
Yeah, but it's interesting you bring that up, because something I've been talking about, and I'll mention it here because you brought it up, is that I think we can't see the American experience either in terms of isolation, because not only Breivik, who I think did all that stuff in Norway, shooting up people, Norwegian young people on an island, who were the sons and daughters of the Norwegian political elite, who were there at a summer camp, and he killed them as an anti-Islamic protest. Because his government was allowing too much immigration. And he said, well, I'll show you. And he killed, 30 or 40 young people and wounded many more. It was one of the great horrors and wake-up calls. But what's interesting about that is that what he did also fits in with a worldwide phenomena, which is that we're not the only people who are radicalizing our version of religion into a kind of a theocratic, revolutionary political content with a lot of violence. I mean, why are young women being raped in Iranian police stations for taking their head covering off by the, why are women arrested in Saudi Arabia? Why have Modi's Hindu nationalists been accused of sending hit squads around the world to kill Sikh activists, and now building a Hindu temple on a ruined mosque that was torn down that had been built in 1600 by the invaders? We, especially liberal Christians, I fault for not being gutsy enough to talk honestly about religious history, because otherwise, maybe you're going to be labeled Islamophobic, or maybe you're going to be liberal but there is no religious history without conquest, violence by the sword. North Africa was not evangelized by nice imams who were giving speeches. It was invaded by Arab armies coming out of the desert. They all went to India, and invaded, and there's still a fight going on now. Evangelical Christians did not, come to South America. The conquistadors did, and they robbed, they stole, they killed, they burned people. I think it's the other way around. The anomaly is any moments of peace in these histories. The rule for all this stuff is, Putin bombing Ukraine. It's a war of religion again, because he has the support of Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church in this holy war against these Ukrainian apostates. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because this is your field. Besides building God's kingdom, do people in this country realize how high the stakes are once we turn the page on religion being a kind of a more civil discourse and unleash the gods of war who have always been there within all these religious movements, I've studied enough history to fear this and to understand that this is an enormous challenge. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I think that there is this core group of conservative Americans, the ones that we started talking about, who think that, well, first of all, they've lived extraordinarily privileged lives. And so when bad things happen, they have largely been insulated from those. So they don't take seriously the potential or the potential impact of destruction. And because of that, and because of some other things, they are chaos and dismantling and destroying is kind of the purpose. When you hear people talk about this as the do nothing Congress, to get back to Mike Johnson, I think that commentators who are referring to them this way don't realize that that's exactly what their constituents want. They want the government to do nothing,
right,
or destroy itself. So I do think it's a small, maybe a large minority. I don't know what, maybe 30% of Americans, maybe not. 30% of voters, let's go with that.
Yeah.
Think that the destruction is the way to get the world back to the place they want it to be. And the rest of America isn't taking that seriously enough.
Yeah. And to the point, I don't want to be too on the nose, because hopefully our conversation here is for all time, not just to this week. But it seems to me that the way Tucker Carlson has gone off to Russia to interview Putin, who he favors, and CPAC, these Christian organizations that now want us to get out of the Ukraine and backing them in favor of Putin because he stands for traditional values.
And have been meeting in Hungary for a couple of years now, right? Yeah.
So, talk about that a little bit, because this is all part of the, you were talking about how they don't want the government to do anything. I don't think I'm out of line in saying that this same movement is now becoming increasingly anti-American. It's like a fifth column of Nazi supporters in World War II by people like Henry Ford and Limburg and others, who always had something good to say about National Socialism and Germany. And now we've got Tucker Carlson on Putin's side, trying to get us defund helping Ukraine resist. Again, we've been here, we've done that. It didn't work out too well. But it's the same movement, and it's their suspicion of the US government to take away our kids or take away our guns. And now look, see, Putin's a Christian. He says things about gay people and trans people. That's our message. America's illegitimate. Take her down. I think these are the enemies within, in a way. And again, I don't think the wider culture understands how radicalized this view is and how it's finding traction.
Well, and to bring it back to where you started, Rushdoony was suspicious of the Constitution, and these folks don't like democracy. They are authoritarian. They think that's the best way to run a government, and they're not particularly concerned about what kind of on the ground political system gives authoritarian power. So it could be a monarchy, could be a democracy if that's how it works. Could be a dictatorship. I mean, it doesn't really matter how the authoritarianism comes to power, but they are essentially authoritarian. They believe that there's only two ways to see things, the right way and the wrong way. They believe that their way is the right way. And they believe that so strongly that they think that the only way to save society is with a strong, powerful leader who will just put it into practice and stop with all this messing around with voting and asking other people's opinions and that sort of thing. It's deeply anti-democratic.
Yeah. And I think that when more secular commentators who don't understand this say, well, how could they go with somebody who's, divorced twice on his third marriage, paid off a porn star? It goes against everything, quote, quote, these Christians stand for. They've totally misunderstood that these Christians are authoritarians who don't care who carries the flag for them as long as somebody does. And fast forward to Tucker Carlson heading off to Russia in a huge propaganda coup for Putin now, interviewing him while Putin is killing his opponents, locking them in prison, having them murdered around the globe. We have an American who, by the way, parenthetically, in my view, should be stripped of his passport as a traitor to the United States of America and maybe put in an isolation ward somewhere and given mental health help. But the fact of the matter is, it's unimaginable to transpose his actions, say, into World War II and have him in the midst, after Pearl Harbor got bombed, have him go off and interview, the Emperor of Japan or whatever it might be, and give him his side of the thing. These folks have nuclear weapons pointed at us, and they are killing people left, right, and center globally. And yet somehow this will be accepted, just like Trump is accepted, by this same group, who are now fundamentally not just anti-democratic, but I think anti-American. They don't like our country. And they see it as bad. They see Russia as somehow even better, because at least there they know what to do with gay people, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is that old saying that nostalgia is the enemy of history, and I suppose, I mean, because if you were to ask them if they like America, they would say yes, they love it. They love the real America, the nostalgic image that they have of America, but they certainly don't love America as it is.
Yeah.
They don't love American democracy. They don't love the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances and those kinds of things. That gives me chills. I love that. I was enamored with civics when I was in 11th grade. The genius of the political structure, with recognizing the potential to abuse power and putting into place guardrails. Now, we've seen those guardrails fail, and we've seen people intentionally destroy those guardrails. And it's hard to know at this point whether any guardrails are going to hold enough to get us through the next, 5 to 8 years. It's hard for me to think about what the country might look like in a decade.
Well, especially when religious liberty is used as a club to beat to death everyone's liberties except this group. I don't think, again, people don't fully understand that.
No, I think they don't.
So let's talk about your book a little bit here before we wrap up. I want to get back to the book. Talk about the conclusions you draw in your book, because I'd like to go there. I don't want to fast forward and read from your own book to you, but you wrap the book up basically, and I want to talk about how you do that and what you see in terms of the future, but also just in terms of the bottom line of understanding of what this movement is and what it's doing.
Well, so the end of the book, I point toward directions that I think we're headed in. And since we haven't mentioned it, this book is not new. This book came out in 2015.
No, I know.
We were in a different place as a country.
I didn't have my podcast then, or I swear I would have done it the week it was released.
Oh, no, it's actually really fun to do it now. I reread it this morning because I thought, we're going to be talking about it, so it should be fresh. But I pointed toward this. So, for example, a confluence of the evangelical movement, the what was then the Tea Party, the kind of anti-government, right-wing redoubt movement out west, and those things kind of coming together in ways where they were sounding the same. I make a lot. I use the way groups sound in terms. I use that a lot because I think so. My training is in history, sociology of religion, and in the discipline that's called religious studies. So the one place that this book got criticized when it came out was that there were some people who were more traditional historians who want to see everything sort of documented with footnotes and references. And so so they were unhappy when I would say that this was Rushdoony's influence because there was no footnote to prove that was the case, right? So they wanted that kind of tie. But, I'm an ethnographer, so I spend time listening to how people talk and the odd words they use and the way that those get echoed from one community to another community. One of the most common ones is that Rushdoony talked about public schools as government schools.
Yeah.
Now that's by itself, we can unpack why he did that and what that meant and all of that. But the first thing to notice is that's just odd. People don't call them that. So when you start to hear people in specific groups that have a shared ethos with the Reconstructionists, shared affinities, shared temperaments, and they're starting to use that kind of language, to me, that means that like you said, people don't know who their intellectual influences are.
Mm.
But that language is carrying Rushdi's influence to these
Sure.
other kinds of groups. And again, it came out in 2015, and I was pointing to those groups kind of coalescing into political movements. This was kind of before Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it came out in 2015, which means it was at the publisher in 2013.
Mm.
But that is what happened. You could, and if you knew how to listen for it, if you thought
Sure.
of it as like a regional accent, if you could hear it, it was there.
Mm.
But you had to have your ears really attuned to the way they speak in order to hear it, because otherwise it just flies on by. And I know we don't want to tie this, we want this for all time. But one of the things that was really interesting to me was when Mike Johnson first became Speaker of the House, suddenly we were all talking about covenantal marriage. I'm thinking,
Mhm. Mhm.
oh, that's interesting. Because who talks about that, right? What is that
Mhm.
even? Most people had no idea.
Yeah.
But this world is all steeped in this notion of the covenant, and everything comes out of covenantalism. And
Mm.
there were some churches that had additional kinds of marriage agreements that were covenantal. And if you tried to get a divorce, you were also excommunicated because you were
Mm.
breaking this covenant.
Mm.
And in a few places, those made their way into a legal system as an option, like Louisiana, where Mike
Mm.
Johnson is from.
Yeah.
Um, it's a legal option there, but mostly it's something that happens in the context of congregations connected to this Protestant Reformed tradition that emphasizes covenantalism. That the
Mm.
Reconstructionists,
Mm.
that one of the chapters in the book is about Vision Forum in San Antonio, Texas, that actually doesn't exist anymore. But
Yeah.
this is a ministry, a homeschool ministry, and a church, and it was founded by Doug Phillips, who is Howard Phillips' son.
Yeah.
If you know who those people are, but if
I
listeners know
do.
who those people are, um, and they had covenantal marriage, right? This is where this comes from.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it just seems to come out of nowhere. But if you're steeped in the language, it's as though it's just as clear as day. It's like they spoke a word out of Spanish, right? If you know the language, but if you don't, it just kind of flies on by.
But what's interesting is how you're making a really great point here. One of the signs of how this is becoming dominant in one political party is that this language suddenly is in the popular press.
Mhm.
And, um, you know, it's a sign of what is seeping into the system on a very high level now. I talked about the fact we were outsiders, but we weren't, people weren't. You
Mhm.
didn't suddenly have someone work a term like predestination into an ordinary political discourse. You have to have been steeped in Calvinist
Or really
theology.
geeky, one or the other,
Yeah,
right?
really geeky. And now all of a sudden it's like, covenant marriages and the whole bit. And then of course, people saying, well, who are you and what do you believe? And he just says, well, just take that Bible off your shelf and read it if you want to know who I am. And of course, in a sort of sardonic way, I would encourage people to do that and just say, well, read the first 5 books of the Bible and you'll get with the program. And this is the world they want to recreate.
Mhm.
And if you're into democracy and freedom of speech or women's rights or anything else, you're going to have a problem in this world. And again, people don't quite see what the program is. Let me wind up by asking you a kind of an open-ended question. You were writing your book, Building God's Kingdom, before Donald Trump became president. In a weird way, you foretold what was going to happen because it's all played out, hasn't it? In political real time, here we are again. I'm not asking you to say who's going to win the next election or how it will go, but where do we go from here? Because I would have thought we're as radicalized now as we're ever going to get with the idea of the white nationalism, the Christian nationalism, Tucker Carlson interviewing Putin, now being on Russia's side instead of America's side, the Republicans trying to defund us, helping Ukraine stand against, a European land war tyranny attack that's straight out of the 1930s and 40s. How much more crazy is this going to be? I mean, is this the end of the American Republic as we understand it? Where does this go? What do you really think? Forget we're doing a podcast here. This is just conversation. I'm curious, Julie, because you've done a lot of thinking about this. Um, and if someone asked me this question, I wouldn't have a good answer. I don't know. So I'm
Yeah.
going to put you on the spot. Oh, wise
Okay,
one.
but I don't have a good answer.
Well,
And if
pretend
you
you
go
do.
listen to other podcasts I've done, I kind of always say this. I think that trying to foretell the future is as much about, like, what I would say is as much shaped by my own temperament as it is any kind of expertise or knowledge that I have.
Mm,
And I tend to be I tend to be pretty dark.
mm,
So I think it's going to get a whole lot worse.
yeah,
I think we're going to see a lot more of this kind of vigilante violence.
yeah.
I am really not at all, well, I don't know how to say it. I don't, I think there's a very high chance that Donald Trump will win the presidency.
Mm,
I don't know what that will mean. I don't know if any, I mean, what by that I mean to say that I don't know where any of these legal efforts will be at that point, if any of them will come to fruition. If he, I just don't even know about that.
mm.
I think there's a good chance that he will win. And I think if he doesn't win, there's a good chance that his followers will explode.
And not
Um,
accept the result.
that, yes, or if, you know, if he's somehow precluded from running, um, you know, so they want to say, well, if, you know, if you take Donald Trump off the ballot and say that he's not eligible to run under the 14th Amendment, then it's just going to be violent outbreak everywhere. Well,
Mm,
that might or might not be true, but if it is true, it's also true if you let him win, if you let him run, it's still
mm.
going to be the same thing. So I don't, so, you know, that those kinds of things don't solve it. I think we're in a really bad place.
Yeah.
But no one wants to get left in that spot. So the answer that I have for this is always that I have friends who are of the opposite temperament, and I
Mm,
hold them very close because I do believe in a division of labor. I think one of the reasons I could see the things that I saw when I wrote my book
mm,
is because of the darkness, because I kind of live in that place.
mm.
And so I could see it with a level of clarity that wasn't clouded by hope. Not to say that hope is bad, hope is actually good,
Yeah.
but sometimes it allows us to hide from danger and ugliness.
Mm,
So I don't have great answers to that question. I always struggle. Interviewers always ask, as I'm sure they ask you. You and I have a mutual friend who's one of those people that keeps me from completely giving up, and that's Diana Butler Bass.
yeah.
She and I've been friends forever. And she's hopeful. Um, Sometimes she and we just always come from really different places on these things.
Mm,
In terms of what we think could happen. Um, I wish I had more optimism. There was someone on NPR the other day who was talking about how small, how incremental the additional amount of voter turnout would be required for Donald Trump not to win.
yeah.
It doesn't, we don't have to convince all of the hardcore Trump supporters to change their minds.
Mm,
We just have to convince a handful of people who don't like Donald Trump to go ahead and vote, right?
yeah.
So I think all is not lost, but I don't, it doesn't look good to me.
Well, we also have to convince some folks that my producer Ernie and I talk about, which is people who say they're liberal or on the left or sane, young people and so forth, that this is not a time to parse differences within the Democratic Party, as in, well, if Joe Biden does this, I can't do that. This is the chips are down. This is it.
Yeah.
And if you think you're having trouble getting anything done with Joe Biden, or you disagree with what's happening in terms of the Middle East, if you think you have a problem now, just wait for the next turn of events if Trump comes back.
Well,
Because
and one of the ways I like to talk to my students about that is that if they really are opposed to Trump, not voting or voting for a third party is like giving half a vote to Trump,
sure,
right? So I think, because I think people think that that's actually being neutral when it's there. Rushdoony's right on this one. There's no neutrality.
yeah,
Yeah, there's
no,
no
I agree.
stance that's neutral here.
Well, that is a good place to finish, and I want to thank my guest
Thank
today,
you.
Julie
It's been a
Ingersoll. And
pleasure.
Julie is a professor of religious studies at the University of Florida. I keep saying North Carolina, too much North Florida in Jacksonville, and author of Building God's Kingdom Inside the World of Christian Reconstruction. And it's really a good book, and I urge people to read it. And I'm so glad we got around to talking, Julie, and
Me
I hope
too.
we continue this
Yeah.
friendship because like I said, having seen my family name in your book quite a bit, I feel like kind we already somehow knew each other. So
Thanks very much.
this has been a real pleasure. Thank you for your time.